Horror has got to be one of the most interesting genres out there when it comes to filmmaking. I mean, some of the all-time classics have come out of it, from Alien to The Thing and even The Shining. What's not to love about the horror genre? But while watching horror films over the years, and films in general, one cycle becomes increasingly obvious with time and has been relevant since the very beginning. And that is what I call the relevance cycle, something that has made or broken a genre with time and how people view the genre as a whole. It's something that I have brought up tons of times in the past, but it's becoming increasingly relevant once again as a lot of modern filmmaking is falling into this cycle. One of the most infamous cases of this happening, which we will get to later, is with creepypastas, where this cycle is what's caused its horrible demise and lack of relevancy that really hasn't turned around until relatively recently. And this has happened many times with different subgenres, with analog horror seeming to be one of the main victims of this cycle as of recently, but other subgenres such as space horror and found footage were victims of this as well. But before going into a deeper explanation, make sure that if you haven't already to like and subscribe. It really helps me a lot with these videos and it really helps make this channel better. Also, I upload once a week, so if you want to be notified when this comes out, make sure to hit the bell icon down below. Okay, now let's begin. So quick explanation of the cycle that I'm talking about before getting into some examples and how we can fix it. So the cycle that we are seeing in stuff like analog horror specifically is the relevancy cycle, which follows 4 different steps. First, we get the originator. This is the film or short that innovates into the subgenre. We saw this most recently with analog horror with Local 58. Most subgenres have a clear beginning, as there usually is some short that has a very clear before and after point, where one subgenre ends and another one begins. For example, with Local 58, there's a very clear cutoff from the decline of creepypastas, as Local 58 takes ideas from the creepypastas of the past and then innovates it with animations and news broadcasts, making the new subgenre. Same with the Blair Witch Project, which took ideas from fake news broadcasts that used to air on television, like the Orson Welles' War of the Worlds radio broadcast, and then combines it with the 90s low-budget horror wave that it was in the middle of, creating the found footage subgenre. There's a very clear before and after of these films generally, as after these are made, the next step begins, which is the meteoric rise, which we have seen tons of times now. The meteoric rise generally is seen as a good period of time within the subgenre, as this is the time of the most innovation, as many artists begin to see these ideas that were interesting as they weren't exactly big yet and decide to make similar ideas to it but with their own twist on them. We saw this most recently with analog horror, as after Local 58 we started to get series like The Mandela Catalog, The Oldest View, and Gemini Home Entertainment, which took ideas from Local 58 and then expanded on them. This is generally one of the best periods of time for the viewers, as there is tons of new and original content that really is trying to change the game of what is interesting and what is not. However, with this meteoric rise comes the next stage, which is the overwhelming point. The overwhelming point is when tons of new series begin to come out that follow an exact similar format to the ones before it, without any new ideas and just rehashing the stuff up before it. Generally, this period is characterized by an overwhelming amount of mediocre content, which is generally made by less experienced and more money-hungry filmmakers. This has happened since the very beginning of film production, with early Hollywood being infamous for running ideas to the ground, as they still do to this very day. Generally, when an idea is seen as potentially profitable, a lot of people try to run the idea into the ground till the cash flow from the subgenre is completely gone, and to show that isn't just a horror issue, we're seeing this most recently with stuff like the superhero subgenre, which, while each film should be judged on a film-by-film basis, has seen a gradual decline in ticket sales as people are getting tired of the subgenre. For horror, though, I think the most relevant example of this step would have to be creepypastas, where at the very beginning it was simply creepy campfire stories that were being told on the internet after the release of Sonic.exe. However, it essentially drove off a cliff of mediocrity. Generally, a major sign of this step is when a lackluster shorts and films begin to pop up as the next big thing, which is the step that I think analog horror is at currently, as when the lackluster shorts begin to grow popular, other people see that and begin to judge the subgenre as a whole because of it. This is why I go after stuff like the Little Red Riding Hood analog horror, because allowing stuff like that to fester without calling it out is just going to cause more people to try and copy it while causing the subgenre to freefall. This is why I go after those bad shorts so often, because once that becomes relevant, it starts to freefall real fast, which leads into the final stage. Which the final stage is, of course, the decline into irrelevancy. It's not like these subgenres will ever truly be forgotten, but there's a stage where the new artists begin to see the subgenre as not worth trying to get into. That's not to say no new content will ever be created within these subgenres, but instead of it being everywhere like it was in its rise, it will instead be more underground just like it was at its very beginning. That's for example why there's still some good creepypastas that come out, it's just not as big as it used to be. Generally this is more of a transitional stage between the two, as when the creepypastas begin to enter the stage, it led to new artists to begin create analog horror. This is a proven step that happens and generally breeds the next wave of innovation as people want to see something new and not the same old thing. This is why I've been saying for months that we need to be a little bit more careful with what gets popular in analog horror, as when mediocrity becomes the norm, then the subgenre will fully collapse. And while full collapses are generally seen as more rare, they still happen a lot. Like as I said, creepypastas went through a complete and full collapse, as many people stopped caring about them for a very long period of time. The only reason they really have come back as of recently is more of a nostalgia thing rather than new and innovative stories coming out. It's a mostly stagnant subgenre, and that's what happens when a full collapse happens. And now let's go over some examples of what this full collapse and cycle may look like. First off, for a non-internet related version of it, there's found footage, which saw its creation with the Blair Witch Project and then blowing up to an insane degree with Paranormal Activity to the point where almost every single film for a period of time was found footage, for better or for worse. There are some generally excellent films within the subgenre, but around the early 2010s, the subgenre became overwhelmed with tons of films that did not need to be found footage and began to lose its edge. While found footage was a good tool for low-budget filmmakers, we started to see blockbusters being filmed in the style to the point where it really was asking, why is it found footage anymore? What made things like found footage so interesting was the edge that it brought to making the stories feel more real than ever, but the constant production of them, even for films that didn't necessarily need them, just made the camera style seem lazier and annoying. This led to the subgenre to decline rapidly, as no one really wanted to see a found footage film anymore. They were all becoming the same, and it was just not interesting anymore, and led to the subgenre completely dying out, as almost no films are made with this found footage style anymore. Like, once again, that's not to say that found footage is completely dead, but if you look now and compare it to like when it was at its prime, there's nowhere near as many found footage films being made anymore. And it's not necessarily to say that every found footage film was bad, it just got into a cycle of being the same type of film over and over again, and people just got bored of it. That's generally what causes these complete collapses, is people getting bored of the subgenre and it just dies. It's not necessarily a good or bad thing, because usually it means that there's going to be a new subgenre that comes out, but also it's just incredibly common, it's just a part of art. Next, there was space horror of the 1970s and 1990s. While Alien is one of my favorite films of all time, after the release of it, it seemed like every single horror film wanted to have a sci-fi undertone for a while. While films like The Thing are an all-time classic, almost direct rip-offs like Galaxy of Terror became increasingly common to the point where the subgenre also began to get annoying. Then we saw a spin of it that finally killed the subgenre off for good, which was putting the slasher film villains like Jason in space while forgetting the ideas that made space horror so relevant in the first place. What makes space horror just so creepy is the confined spaces and the unknown that surrounds you at all times. There's no one here to save you or help you, and when the films start to begin to forget that, the ideas begin to get boring and way less interesting to the point of becoming completely irrelevant. Now, it's not to say that space horror is completely dead. There are still some facets of it that are still alive, like the Alien franchise is still going well and good, it's just nowhere near as big as it was in its prime. But there's still games like Dead Space that came out and changed the subgenre as a whole. It still has innovation, it's just nowhere near as fast and as constant as it once was. Finally, no example of this phenomenon will ever be more relevant than creepypastas, as it follows this format to the greatest extent possible. With the humble beginnings of Ted the Caver to the meteoric rise caused by Slender Man, and then the decline caused by stories like Jeff the Killer and Silent.exe, and then the complete and total collapse and fall into irrelevancy. This is one of the clearest examples you can possibly see of this cycle, as it follows the cycle to a T. And while there are other examples, none of them will ever be as obvious as creepypastas were, as almost anyone can notice the pattern here. We all remember just how mediocre stories like Sonic.exe were, and the wave of mediocrity that came after it, which generally informed our opinions on the subgenre as a whole. That's why maintaining the integrity of the subgenre is so important, as if mediocrity starts to grow, then that's what you become known for. I do not advocate for gatekeeping, but maintaining the level of quality throughout the subgenre is one of the only ways to make sure that public opinions on the subgenre don't swap towards the worst. For example, one of the areas that actually avoided this somewhat despite some people's opinions on it, the SCP Foundation started to moderate what was released on the website a ton to try and make sure the stories were up to par. This has kept the image of what people think about SCPs a little bit cleaner, as a lot of the best stories have stayed relevant, as there isn't the overwhelming amount of slop that surrounds it. This is why stuff like the SCP-087-B is still talked about to this day, and not the slop that used to overwhelm the SCP Foundations for years until the moderation team did a full wipe. So maintaining a level of quality isn't just important for the viewers trying to find new stuff, but also for maintaining how the subgenre is viewed as a whole, as the more stigma that a subgenre has, the less relevant it becomes with time. And that is all for this week. Make sure if you like this video to like and subscribe, and let me know if you agree or disagree. Do you see this cycle, or do you think that this is something entirely different? Let me know what you think in the comments down below, and I'll see you all next week.